Hi students, it's your instructor, Anna Otto. I just wanted to go ahead and do a quick recording of the office lecture, Zoom office lecture that I gave this week on Tuesday. So Tuesday was the 26th of April. Since this was a bonus lecture, if you will, I just looked at a few things that kind of carried through the different modules in the adulthood unit. So, our early adulthood, talking about kind of the main tasks, I try to capture those in these graphics that I put at the top of each of the modules. And so the idea of first comes love, then comes marriage, then comes the baby and the baby carriage captures a lot of what is going on in the focus of early adulthood. Erickson tells us that it's the period of intimacy where individuals are working on intimacy, finding a significant other, settling down, starting their family. Along with that, career is a big focus, and that's not captured in this graphic, but that's another focus of this age period. Middle adulthood, then, the 40s and 50s to about 65, is a period of change in terms of often social obligations. So if one had their children back in early adulthood during that period, 18 through the 20s and 30s, then it's not uncommon for those children to launch or move off on their own in middle adulthood. And so couples often are left with the two of them in new roles with adult children, as well as moving into roles as grandparents. Some of you may remember, many of you may not, the Cialis commercials that were popular a bit ago. Cialis is an erectile dysfunction medication, and for some reason they use these side-by-side tubs. So anybody who knows that advertising campaign might recognize this image and those tubs. Finally, late adulthood being 65 to end of life, on average around 80 years old. And Western countries, such as our own, this is sometimes called the golden years or the winter of life. And so I tried to pick this image, older couple, if you can see a little bit more hunched over and they're walking, and then just kind of the coloration giving us the sensation of kind of moving into that winter season. So that's just a little bit behind what was included in the graphics, why I selected them, what I hope to capture with them, and just a review of the major age periods in adulthood. So obviously we talk about changes in each of the three domains, the physical domain, the cognitive domain, and then the emotional and social domain as we go through the adult modules. And this particular slide about general physical development is pulled from the middle adulthood review slides. And so what is the general trend in physical development in middle adulthood? And I'm using this slide just to give myself a chance to talk about the trends over adulthood. So overall, early adulthood is still a period of growth and development, although it's also a period where senescence or aging starts to kick in, particularly by the middle of early adulthood. Changes, though, are measurable, but typically not functional. That's item 2 there. So in early adulthood, under high stress conditions, researchers are able to measure things such as decline in cardiovascular functioning. But in terms of day-to-day activities and living, most adults don't feel those. By the time one moves into middle adulthood, starting to get a little more recognition, a little bit more acknowledgement of some of those declines. Still, majority of people rate their health as good or excellent. And while some of the declines are certainly becoming more noticeable. They don't tend to interfere with daily functioning yet. However, by late adulthood, many of these declines become not only measurable, not only observable, but also functional, so that they're actually slowing down, interfering with daily functioning, with daily activities. Some of the ways to compensate, um, in middle adulthood, just recognizing that you're not as, young and spry as you once were, recognizing that part of the process of aging is slowing down a little bit. Um, and that if you really want to be performing at a super high level, you might need to do some extra training, maybe more than you did prior to middle adulthood. And by late adulthood, again, adjusting activity to appropriate levels and appropriate types for the age period. Also, making sure to be as healthy as possible, making sure to eat well, making sure to get adequate exercise, making sure to get enough sleep as much as possible, reducing risk, or sorry, not risk, stress. So, all of those kind of general tips for healthy living. This slide looks at the causes of death between early and middle adulthood. Certainly, most individuals, as I said, have an average life expectancy of around 80 years. So, death is the exception in early adulthood and even in middle adulthood. We talked a little bit, or I talk a little bit in the middle adulthood chapter about the different causes of death, and we still see the same top three causes of death: unintentional injury, cancer, and then heart disease or cardiovascular disease. What we see between early adulthood and middle adulthood is a reordering. So in early adulthood, the most common cause of death is unintentional injury, followed by cancer, and then heart disease. Middle adulthood, the diseases are outpacing the injuries. So cancer followed by heart disease and then unintentional injury. It's interesting, if you look closely between these two charts, the rate of unintentional injury actually isn't changing that much. It's just that while it's still the exception, there are more people that are succumbing to illnesses, specifically to cancer and to heart disease. And if you look closely, you'll also see that the scale changes. So over on the left, it's showing 0, 10, 20, 30, right, per 100,000. Over on the right, 50, 100, 150,000 per 100,000. So there are more deaths that are occurring in middle adulthood than late adulthood. So, new information about late adulthood. Again, notice the scale changing. So now rather than starting at 10 or starting at 50, we're starting at 200. So 200, 400, 600, 800 per 100,000 in terms of annual deaths from these different diseases. And so, like we saw in middle adulthood, we still see heart disease and cancer as the top killers, although they're happening at a much higher frequency than they were in middle adulthood. And then we're also adding in some other diseases and illnesses, so specifically chronic respiratory disease, stroke, and Alzheimer's disease. Unintentional injuries, again, still holding fairly constant, but no longer in our top list of causes of death. We also look at, as we said, the other two domains, so cognitive changes. We know that in early adulthood, it's an overall period of improvement or growth for most individuals. Talked a bit about middle adulthood, the differences between fluid cognitive skills and crystallized cognitive skills. Fluid skills starting to decline by middle adulthood, whereas crystallized skills continuing to show improvement. Crystallized skills are our knowledge base. It's that information tied to experience, tied to culture, versus the fluid skills, more of that information processing, speed of dealing with information. By late adulthood, we start to see overall declines in cognitive function. Although those crystallized skills decline much slower in general than those fluid skills, and certain subsets of crystallized skills tend to stay intact longer than others. And again, just practice helps. That's why it's important to keep your brain active, whether it's participating in some type of organized activities or maybe doing daily exercises of the brain. So things like crossword puzzles, word puzzles, that type of thing. And then in terms of emotional and social development, have a couple slides here to highlight a few of the major theories and concepts that we look at. So we start with Erikson. We talk about Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, and for each of the age periods, we check in with Erikson. So when we're looking at the adult years, early adulthood, intimacy versus isolation, middle adulthood, generativity versus stagnation, and then late adulthood, ego integrity versus despair. And Erikson is still pretty well respected, his theory, and talked about. However, there have also been some other theorists who kind of fine-tuned Erikson's ideas. And in particular, we've been introduced to Levinson. So Daniel Levinson has the Seasons of Life theory. He started by interviewing young men and then came back and interviewed some young women. It's kind of this stair-step approach where you have an entry transition, about 5 to 7 years, and then a kind of life structure settling period, a mid-period transition, and then again a little more settling, and then moving into then the midlife transition, and then stepping through middle adulthood, late adulthood transition, stepping into late adulthood. Specifically, we've gotten a little more information. So in early adulthood, the idea of developing a dream, a picture, an image of what one hopes for their early adult years, that being in the transition. Men in particular focusing on career in their 20s, and then bringing in intimacy in their late 20s, early 30s, settling down into career and family. When Levinson went back and interviewed women, finding the idea that women have sometimes a split dream where they're simultaneously thinking about career and family versus men that seem to more stair step it. In middle adulthood, when we talk about Levinson or are introduced to Levinson, we're told about these four kind of issues that need to be resolved: the idea of young, old, destruction, creation, masculinity, femininity, and then engagement, separateness. So kind of figuring out where in that spectrum one falls. And again, kind of stepping through this transition, settling life structure, and then ultimately coming out into the late adulthood transition. And then late adulthood really focusing on life reflection. Remember, Erikson talks about that as integrity or ego integrity, kind of coming to terms, reflecting on one's life, and making amends and peace with that. Another theorist, Valiant, like Levinson, has an alternative approach to looking at the same information as Erikson, or addressing some of the same information. Erikson looked in those big blocks of time, so the age periods. Valiant broke it down by decades, so 20s devoted to intimacy concerns, 30s career concerns, 40s that generativity or giving and guiding the next generation, 50s and 60s then kind of extending that generativity into keepers of meaning, or sometimes you'll hear it, keepers of culture. It's when oftentimes those in middle adulthood kind of take over as the senior generation to keep traditions going. And then late adulthood, more of a focus on spirituality and reflection, again, kind of wrapping up one's life story. Last thing I'm going to bring up here is the family life cycle. And so we are introduced to the family life cycle. I actually introduced it back in my introductory video, but talk about it in early adulthood. And that's the idea, kind of standard series of events that individuals throughout the world go through in their development, and focusing in on the adult years and early adulthood. People typically move out on their own, find that significant other, marry, bear children, rear children, start their, careers in order to sustain themselves. By middle adulthood, kind of those children that were born when an adult was in early adulthood, sometime in middle adulthood, they mature themselves, the children, and then launch out into their own adult lives. Used to be called the empty nest. Now the preference is to talk about launching children, so more of a positive take on it because that is the appropriate step, what we hope for. And so parenting responsibilities often diminish. That means redefining of relationship between spouses, with friends, with family. We've talked about that sandwich generation where those in middle adulthood still have some care and responsibility for their young adult children, but also starting to perhaps assume some responsibility for aging parents. And then finally, in late adulthood, retirement, growing old, and death of a spouse. So just kind of talking about the circle of life, right? Okay, hope this is helpful. Just kind of a bonus overview of some of the key things happening across the adult years and looking at the specific theories and concepts and how those carry through the adult years. Okay, take care.